Good afternoon, everyone. I am Linda Wood from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's webinar on the racial equity transformation at Demos. There are 350 people registered for this webinar today, and probably many more attending because we know it's taking place in conference rooms across the country, which is really a testament to the growing interest in how to operationalize racial equity, not just externally, but internally inside organizations. So we are here today to learn about the journey at Demos. In 2014, Demos embarked on a racial equity transformation that was comprehensive, multifaceted, and organization-wide. And it has had major implications, not just for Demos, but also for the field. Demos has been inundated with, and in November released a case study that lays out major components of their transformation and lessons learned. Today we'll have a chance to hear from the 3 report authors who led the transformation, and then that's where all of you come in. The success of this webinar will really depend on you. The presentation will be relatively brief, but most of our time together will be devoted to answering questions you have. So a little about our agenda. I'm going to start today by introducing our panelists, Heather, Lucy, and Angela, and then I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who will address why Demos has undertaken this work. Lucy will then spend about 20 minutes providing an overview of this case study content, and then we will spend the rest of our time together responding to questions from all of you. And this is a little bit of an experiment. A quick shout out to Jose Gonzalez in New York and Holly Delaney Cole in San Francisco, who are both helping us with questions that we'll pose to the panel. So let's start with introductions. I'd first like to introduce Heather McGhee, who perhaps needs no introduction. Heather joined Demos in 2002 and served as the president from 2014 through June of 2018. She's a recognized thought leader on the national stage and is currently a distinguished senior fellow at Demos, where she is focused on advancing the mission of Demos through her writing, public speaking, and media appearances. Heather's currently writing a book, and it's going to be published this year, about the personal, economic, and societal costs of racism to everyone in America, including white people. Heather is also a new mom to a beautiful baby boy named Riaz. Lucy Mayo. Lucy first joined Demos in 2005 and took on her current role as Senior Vice President of Organizational Development in 2012. Lucy has 20 years of experience in the nonprofit and governmental sectors, and prior to Demos, worked at Teach for America, the New York City Council, and the Women's Housing and Economic Development Corporation. Finally, Angela Park. Angela is a consultant, researcher, and writer dedicated to making social justice and equity hallmarks of progressive institutions across advocacy, policymaking, philanthropy, education, and business. She helps organizations embed social justice and equity throughout their operations and their programs. Previously, Angela worked at the White House in both terms of the Clinton-Gore administration, at the Center for Policy Alternatives, and at the Environmental Leadership Program. So those are our 3 panelists. I am now going to turn it over to Heather, Lucy, and Angela, who will each provide highlights from the report. To you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Linda. And I just want to say thank you to the Haas Jr. Fund and to, as well, Caitlin Kerwin on our staff, who is making sure that this multi-participant webinar goes off without a hitch. Thank you so much. So as Linda said, I recently stepped down as president of Demos, and in many ways, one of the reasons I felt that I could make this transition was because of the truly deep transformation that the organization had undertaken under my leadership, with the leadership very much of the 2 women here with me on the panel over the course of the 4 years that I was president. As Lucy will show in her overview of the transformation, pretty much by every single factor, the organization changed except for its core mission. And I want to say a little bit about why we undertook this process, which was not always easy, certainly was not free or inexpensive, but ultimately is the thing I'm the most proud of about my time at DMOS. Our mission is to create an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And when the organization was founded, there was a sense that racial disparities were, in fact, a detriment to the kind of equality that was at the heart of the vision. And yet, the organization had not done the work of making sure that in order to create the equality that we wanted to see in the world, each and every member of the staff and the board, and then by extension our partners and our funders, really had the skills that it took to practice racial equity in interactions at work, to be able to read situations, to be able to read what was going on in our country with a racial equity lens. And, as Linda has often said, I've heard her say that there wasn't a handbook for this. It was surprising to me when I took it on and we first engaged Angela, that there wasn't just something off the shelf that we could do. And so that's part of why we really wanted to make this available. For those of you on the call, I know there are many people who are the leaders of your organizations. I want to just say a little bit about what it took to sort of set out on transformation of an organization like this. I will say that it takes a certain amount of humility, patience, and also stubbornness to be able to both set out a vision for the transformation that you want to see, but also be humble about your own blind spots. But then, of course, stubbornness to be able to hold to it, even when it's difficult. And people really do look to the leader of an organization to set and hold the vision for that. We'll talk later on about sort of the different places in an organization where this work can lie. And one of the lessons that we learned is that when it's held at the top of the organization, the people with the most decision-making authority, it can be the most successful. And then finally, I do want to just say that this was an incredible team effort. And so the strength of the team at the outset is really important, as well as I can say that the team was deeply strengthened by the work. People have been able to bring their whole selves into the organization more than they ever could before. And so the relationships that you create become more authentic and more powerful, and you become able to move more quickly in the world at the speed of trust, as they say over at Rockwell. And so one of the people that we brought into the team, and let's see all of our warts and wrinkles, was Angela Park. And Angela Park is one of the field's leading consultants in this area, and was with us from the very beginning, and has really helped to make sure that we stayed on track, to help expand the scope of our vision, and to help really create wonderful relationships within the staff for people who needed the guidance of someone who was outside of the organization. And so Angela, thank you so much for being part of the report that we released in November, and also for being part of this today.
So I was asked to just say a couple of things from the context that I bring as someone who works certainly with organizations like DMOS, but more broadly across progressive spaces and movements. And not just in nonprofits, but also in philanthropy and other kind of broader sectors. And one thing I would just say at the outset is we're going to talk quite a bit about the importance about really having a clear rationale for why this work matters to an organization, and how it really does not only strengthen the organization, but actually enable you to achieve your mission. And writ large, I would say a little bit more broadly, there's a high bar for those of us who are doing work in mission-driven institutions to live up to our values. If you look around the headlines right now in American culture and society, there are plenty of examples of organizations that, regardless of the kind of institution they are having to pay attention to issues around how women experience the workplace, with regard to the kind of culture people have in order to be able to show up and do their best work. regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation. There are plenty of horror stories of what happens when organizations don't pay attention to these issues and actually think of it as a side project. I would really argue that progressive institutions have quite a ways to go with regard to fully living our values, and is based on how we manage ourselves, run our organizations, think about who is represented within the context of the work, and to the degree that organizations that have a general kind of it's the right thing to do stance around caring about equality and justice, those things don't matter if we don't practice what we preach, and if when you look at who's engaged in solving the critical issues of the day, if the people most impacted by the issues on which we work aren't somehow having a voice. And so I think there is just a very important impetus for nonprofit institutions and philanthropy and other mission-driven groups to have to make this a bigger priority, despite the fact that no one feels like they have extra time, and people obviously feel like they have plenty on their plate. And so you cannot look around this country and our institutions and not think we have to do the same thing too. And our good values and good intentions in the world and focus on making the world a better place in and of itself doesn't give us an excuse to not actually do this work. So those are just a couple things I would flag as we just start to kind of dig into the details.
Thank you so much, Angela. So I am thrilled to be here today. I'm Lucy Mayo, and I am going to walk us through some of the highlights of our journey here at Demos. I feel so honored to have been a part of this journey over the years with Angela, with Heather, with the entire Demos staff and board. So I'm going to walk through some of the key components of the report that hopefully many of you in the webinar have had a chance to review. I'm going to start by talking about some context of Demos and where we were at the start of this transformation, and then talk a bit about our process to impact, as well as the lessons that we have learned. So as Heather said earlier, Demos is a public policy and advocacy organization. We are working at the intersection of political and economic inequality. We use research and advocacy and strategic communications and legal strategies to work for an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and equal chance in our economy, as Heather mentioned earlier. We were founded in 2000 by predominantly a group of white men and had white male presidents for 13 of our 18-year history. We also had a majority white staff and leadership body for 16 of our past 18 years. In 2014, as you've heard, Heather McGhee was named president of Demos. And Heather brought to the presidency a recognition that racial bias and discrimination were key barriers to fulfilling our mission, as you heard Heather talk about before, and that striving to dismantle white supremacy was necessary if we at Demos were able to win the progressive policy change that increased economic and political equality for everybody. So one of the first actions Heather took was to launch our transformation. And this was a multi-year comprehensive transformation you've heard about. And the goal of this transformation at its heart is to really build the racial equity skills and practices of our staff, to equip them to tackle racism and to center race in all of the work that they do. A couple more pieces on context here before we dig into the process of our transformation. It's really important to know that at the very start of our transformation, we took this multifaceted approach where we really were looking to address the how of our work, so the organizational culture and how we worked together, what our relationships were like, as well as what we call the what of our work, the actual content, programmatic content of our work. And at the very start, Heather and I actually interviewed a number of organizations who had gone through similar transformations. As you heard earlier from Heather, we quickly found out there was no handbook for how to do this. And it also became clear that many organizations had either focused on the how of the work or the what of the work, but not both simultaneously. So many organizations are focused on the racial diversity of their staff, for example, or the kind of content pieces of their programmatic work. But again, very few had tackled both simultaneously. Another piece of context, it's important to note that at the start of our transformation, we had around 40 staff members across 3 different offices. Of those staff, 73%, as you can see on the presentation here, identified as white, and 27% of staff identified as people of color. And our executive team was a team of 6, and there was 1 person of color in our executive team. At that time, Heather, who was president. Currently, Demos has 55 staff. Just want to bring us up to date a little bit on the context here at Demos. We have 55 staff. We now are across 2 different offices. Our annual budget is $13 million. Back when we started this effort, it was around $9 million. So a bit about the process we went through. Again, this is detailed in our report, but some highlights here. We had a number of key stakeholders and actors that made this transformation possible. As you heard, we engaged Angela Park quite early as an outside consultant to help us with this transformation. We did interview a number of consultants at the start, and we really found Angela to share our values and our orientation. And Angela worked hand in hand with us very intensely really over the first 2 years, building our strategy and implementing our multi-year plan. Angela's been absolutely incredible and instrumental to our overall effort. Another set of stakeholders was our executive team. So Heather mentioned this before. We had complete and total buy-in from our senior leaders, from our executive team, from our president. And our executive team really, really understood the need to go through this kind of transformation to fulfill our mission, and we're willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. In addition, the overall management of the effort, the day-to-day of managing the effort, was assigned to the second most senior staff member at the organization. At the time was myself. As Heather said, really having that senior level buying and ownership proved to be quite critical to its overall success. We also created a body of staff that we called a Racial Equity Advisory Group. And this body consisted of 14 staff members who really represented a cross-section of the organization, and they were charged with advising us, the executive team, on the transformation. The report talks much more in detail about this, but the final stakeholder I want to talk about, actually there's 2 more stakeholders, but one of the final is funders. So we were really fortunate to experience a confluence of tailwinds that allowed us to have substantial funding for this. As Heather said, this does cost a lot. It's worth every penny. But we were able to get some new funding as a result of Heather's leadership, transition funding. We were able to get some funding earmarked for this transformation by individuals and foundations. And as we started to really center race in our work more consistently, we got new program funding that supported that race center, race forward work. Finally, our board. So our board was supportive of our transformation from the outset. They really saw it as important for the organization, also as a piece to Heather's new presidency of the organization. The board had 2 retreats dedicated to this work. Some organizations, some of you on the call may find that you need a transformation process just for your board, and we can talk more about that later. We did not. We really kept our board informed. We had those 2 retreats. We kept them informed about key milestones, and we sought their advice and guidance along the way. Our transformation included 4 major components. I'm going to talk a bit about each, but those 4 components were a foundational analysis, which we touched on earlier, an organizational assessment, a learning phase, and an implementation phase. Heather talked earlier about that really important start of the process, having a foundational analysis to guide the overall effort. For us, it was so important to get staff fully bought into that foundational analysis, and it allowed us to turn this from a nice-to-have set of growth and skill-building opportunities to a must-have, to really see it as mission critical. And our staff really came into this effort already excited and hungry for it, but taking the time to clearly articulate why focusing on race, why building skills and practice around racial equity was so important, has been absolutely fundamental and critical to our overall success. And we still, that was written back in 2014, and to this day in 2019, we still refer to it as part of our ongoing journey. As I mentioned, another step in our process was an organizational assessment. This assessment was designed and led by Angela and included a mandatory anonymous all-staff survey, interviews with staff, we had a focus group with some select staff, and we knew going in that there was learning and growth that was needed, but this assessment was so critical for us to really identify what the learning gaps were. and allowed us to feed it to the next phase, which we'll hear more about shortly. Our assessment, when it was done, it took about 4 or 5 months. The findings, we were fully transparent with the findings. We shared the findings first with the executive team, with our racial equity advisory group, and then with our board and the full staff. So after that assessment, we then built our learning plan. And the first stage of our learning plan was actually to develop these competencies, new racial equity competencies for all staff. We recognize that in order to be, a race-centered, race-conscious, inclusive organization, we were going to have to shift our expectations of the staff at this organization. So we had organization-wide competencies that were put in all job descriptions, and then team leaders and team directors developed team-specific competencies that were specific to the work of their teams. After that point, we developed a learning plan, learning curriculum that was really intended to build the skills to fulfill those competencies. Our learning phase, our intensive learning phase, the learning will go on forever, but the intensive learning phase was from March 2015 to early 2016. And it took all forms. Staff did readings, we had workshops, we had, I think we had 11 trainings and workshops over that time period. It was a lot of time. We had discussion groups. And we also had what we called racial equity learning groups. So I want to talk a little bit about this. These are often called affinity groups at other organizations. As folks on this call may already know, and maybe too obvious to state, but people of color and white people have very different lived experiences with the issue of race and racism. And so types of conversations and interventions that white people need to be having can be very different than those that staff of color need to be having. So we created these small learning groups, often called affinity groups, and they were led by Angela as well. As part of this learning phase, we also took a fresh look at our systems, our practices, through a racial equity lens. This resulted in changes throughout our employee handbook, but most significantly, we made substantial changes to how we hire staff. We created a new hiring protocol. The protocol was designed to reduce implicit bias and to push back against the structural racism that's made it really difficult for people to enter our field and to rise in our field. Our hiring handbook is available to folks who would like to see it. It has 5 major components of our new hiring process. One, we require a standardized interview process for all positions throughout the organization. We screen candidates for racial equity competencies coming into the organization. We also, as part of that standardized process, have standardized interview questions for all candidates across all stages of the process. We also now hire by committee, and we try very hard to create diverse hiring committees. And finally, and this is quite probably the most important, is we now require racially diverse interview pools. So we have a requirement that all pools of candidates coming in for first round interviews be comprised of 50% applicants of color. So after this learning phase, we used our regularly scheduled work planning, which we do every year, to develop fresh programmatic project plans that centered race in new ways. Staff brought new skills and practices to that work planning process, and we developed new tools to really make sure that race was centered in our project work plan for the years ahead. So what has the impact been of all of this? Our work has changed significantly over the years as a result of this learning, as a result of increased practice around racial equity. We've engaged in new research on race. We've entered new partnerships with organizations that share our racial equity values and orientation. And we've taken on new kinds of legal work that directly addresses racial inequities. Our report, as some of you may have read, does highlight 2 case studies to really demonstrate how all of this learning, this growth, this skill building has impacted the work of the organization. We've also drastically increased the racial diversity of our staff over probably a 2 to 3 year period. We saw this increase. To remind you, when we started the effort in 2014, 60% of our staff, 27% of our staff identified as staff of color. Today, in 2019, 60% of our staff identify as people of color. And our leadership also reflects this shift. 50% of our executive team are people of color, and 60% of our directors team, which is the next layer of leadership down, identify as people of color. Finally, on impact, we are now seen in the field as a race-forward organization and are sought out for our racial analysis. This has really opened new doors for us. It has also just made our work more impactful. We have a broader reach and we're doing better work. We've learned a lot along the way. I'm going to quickly share some of the lessons we've learned, and then we can definitely talk more about these lessons when we get into the Q&A portion of our time together. As I referred to earlier, housing ownership for this effort in senior leadership proved to be very, very important, and it's something that we highly recommend. I imagine some on this webinar have experienced the shortcomings of executives delegating race-related initiatives to what's often called diversity committees. Often those diversity committees are staffed by young people of color, by folks who have other subordinate identities, and by folks who don't have a lot of decision-making power within the organization. So again, we decided to house this at the senior level of the organization, which really showed how important it was for the whole staff. Another key lesson for us is really articulating that foundational rationale for why focusing on race matters to your organization at this moment in time. We strongly believe that if that step is just skipped, it's hugely problematic, and I think people see that as kind of a small thing to not worry about. It's instrumental and huge, and we can talk more about that during the Q&A, but that's another real lesson for us. We continue to go back to that consistently. Another key lesson is in order to really make the learning stick and the skills stick for staff, to develop racial equity competencies, new expectations of staff around racial equity skills. Again, it really changes all of this learning and growth and practice change from a nice to have to a must have. One thing that we would have done differently upon reflection is we would, if we could do it all over again, we would have done an intensive learning curriculum with our senior staff, senior leaders first, before rolling out to the rest of the organization. At the start of our effort, our staff had varying levels of racial equity analysis, skills, and practice, and that included our senior staff. And by having our senior staff learn at the same time as leading, it caused some challenging situations. So if we could do things over again, we would do intensive learning first with our senior staff and skill building with our senior staff so they could lead their staffs effectively through their own transformation process. Again, we talked about this earlier. We do strongly encourage creating spaces for staff of color and for white staff to have conversations, have skill building, have growth experiences together within those groups. Some organizations find this to be challenging. We really think it's a best practice, and it proved very valuable for us. When doing it, it's very important to be very clear about why you're doing it, have a clear rationale for why, and what the outcomes are of those experiences, desired outcomes, and it's very important to have skilled facilitation of those kinds of groupings of staff. And then the other thing that we found to be quite important is for some staff, all of this learning and all of these intentional growth plans were great and sought the transformation we were seeking. Other staff couldn't quite get as far as we hoped they could have. So we had individual coaching available for some staff. That's another best practice we want to share with folks, that having high quality coaching available to staff is very, very important to seek the transformation we're looking for. Then finally, the hiring piece. Equity and fairness in how staff are hired matters immensely. So really, really taking a look at your hiring process, developing a process that is focused on reducing bias is key, as well as really thinking about the networks in which staff are recruiting other staff, new hires, with a majority white staff that have majority white networks. For us, creating a systematic process to recruit qualified candidates of color is critical to our success in racially diversifying our staff. So we're going to open up to questions. Before we do, I just want to say that our work is ongoing. Our journey continues every day here at Demos. And we have made lots and lots of mistakes along the way. Some big mistakes, some small mistakes. We continue to make mistakes. That's part of the journey. We learn from those mistakes. In addition, this work has been hard. I want to be really clear about that. It's hard work, and it should be hard work. We continue, even after these years of investment and effort and intention, we continue to struggle with such things as a conflict averse culture, with white fragility and white silence. And even though we're now a majority person of color organization, we really continue to live with a long legacy of a white dominant culture. So we're still working on these things, and we'll continue to in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. So we don't have all the answers, but our impact, our funding, our reach, our growth, our ability to work together across difference, across race, have all really improved, increased. It's had a huge impact on the organization. And something that we hear a lot from staff is that this transformation we have gone through has really felt like a gift to them, that no matter, this really transcends race, that staff rarely have received this kind of explicit investment in what may very well be the most important set of knowledge and skills a person can have in this country to contribute and flourish today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Linda and really look forward to the questions that we hear from all of you on the webinar today.
Well, first of all, I just want to appreciate all three of you, the authors of this report, for taking the time to put out such candor and hopefulness and clarity about what it really takes to transform the what, but also the how and the who and the so what about doing this kind of work. So we are now going to open up to all of you for questions. And I'd like to say just a few words about logistics. When you want to ask a question, you need to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we will not be using the chat function, and we will not be using the raise your hand function. So to ask a question, please.
Linda, we just lost you, I think.
We're going to pause for a minute. We're just going to fix this technology here.
How was I on? Okay.
There,
now you go.
Okay, we've got Linda back.
Sorry. I'd like to acknowledge the time that you took to reflect on your experience and put out such a candid and hopeful case study and just what it means to transform the what, but also the how and the who of your work and the so what of doing this work as well. So we are now going to open up to all of you for questions. A few words about logistics. When you want to ask a question, you need to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using the chat function. We will not be using the raise your hand function. So to ask a question, please just type into the Q&A button. And this is important because this is how we're organizing the questions to pose to our panelists. And feel free to type in questions at any time throughout the webinar. Given how many participants are on this webinar, we're not likely to get to every question, but you are welcome to contact Demos after the webinar for follow-up information. So while your questions are coming in, I'm going to kick us off with one to get us started. Many of us have been very impressed by the amount of work that went into the changes at all levels of Demos. I mean, it's truly been remarkable. How did you balance doing the regular work of your organization with the work that was required for moving through this racial equity transformation?
Good question. So it wasn't easy. It wasn't always easy, and we had to calibrate often. I think you have to know your own organization's culture. Do you move quickly? Do you move slowly? We, particularly at that time, new leadership, we're moving very quickly. We're very ambitious. And the personalities of the leadership were ones that wanted to take on a lot all the time and say yes to everything and you know, just be ambitious. It felt like in many ways the world was crumbling around us, and so we had to do it all. So you have to know what your inclinations are. Our inclination was to do too much too fast. And so that contributed to a great sense of momentum and sort of, if you were a staff person, you felt like the racial equity work was going on all around you all the time. You didn't lose sight of it. That's really important and great, right? So often it gets shunted off to a committee. You don't really know what's going on. It really felt 360 in total. And then there were times when staff members said, you know what, I haven't been able to do this, filing that I need to do, or I'm staying too late to get it done. And so we, as an executive team, pulled back the reins, slowed down, moved deadlines. You do have to be responsive and know yourselves. But I'll say the other thing is that this is where, again, and I will sound like a broken record on this, making it mission critical and over communicating your analysis of why racism is absolutely detrimental to your business strategy, your mission, the work that you're doing every day is so important, because it didn't feel like a nice to have. It didn't feel like a distraction. We started this work, our first retreat on this work was about a month before Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. And so we also had the benefit of an echo chamber of urgency around these issues. And I think certainly for everyone doing this work now, there is that feeling as well. And so it didn't feel like a distraction. It felt like urgent and critical work.
I'll just add to that. I also think that group of staff, the Racial Equity Advisory Group that we had, a 14-member body, we could go to them and really check ourselves. Are we doing too much? Are we doing too little? That's a really important body to have because senior leadership can get in a little bit of a bubble at times. So we were constantly kind of going and asking, how do these plans look for the next 2 months? How does this feel? And we were very flexible, as you said, we were very responsive and made adjustments as needed.
So we're getting a number of questions about your process for how you identified an equity consultant to help you with this work.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I mentioned earlier that one of the very first things that I did and Heather did as well with me for some of them was talk to other organizations that had gone through a similar kind of transformation effort. And some of the organizations had done not as much as we wanted to do or had a different orientation towards it, but it's still quite helpful to talk to other organizations in the field and just heard their perspectives on folks they had talked to. That was quite helpful to get names of folks. And when we started interviewing, we interviewed people. They're nice, scheduled phone calls with various consultants and interviewed them. And we had such a strong vision of what we wanted. We went in with a very strong vision, so that helped a lot. I think that's quite important. I think if you're wishy-washy, it can make it really hard to find the right person. And we also asked a lot about their familiarity with the type of work that we do, right? So there's lots of fabulous consultants out there. Angela, we're quite fortunate to have found somebody who actually has a policy background, so kind of understands what it means to work within a policy organization. So I know that can be hard sometimes, but for us, that was another important piece of vetting consultants, was who can really understand the type of staff who work at this organization and the type of work that we do. Because it was this transformative change. So really understand the type of organization they were working with and the type of work they were doing was quite important. So it was interviews, it was research, it was staying really clear on what we were looking for.
Angela, as a equity consultant yourself, do you have, I have two questions for you. Do you have advice in that regard, sort of choosing an equity consultant? And can you also, there's some questions coming in on it, can you also speak to what does readiness look like? When, what does it look like when an organization is ready to take on this kind of work?
Yeah, I was going to add something to the conversation about, and this may sound funny coming from me, like this is how you should interview people like me, but I think I'm having this conversation right now with a bunch of different organizations that are at the stage, and DEMOS is at the stage, where they have actually carved out roles and competencies for every single person, but also comes a point in which people say we need some staff capacity to do some of this. And so, Jose, who was hired at Demos, in talent management, does do a chunk of this work. It's been built into people's job descriptions. But when organizations are first starting out in this work, I think one of the most important questions they need to ask themselves is, what exactly do we need now? Are there capacities within the organization that we can build on instead of just expecting that an outside consultant is going to come and bring everything? And outside consultants bring strengths like every other human being. And so there are people who are great at getting up in front of a bunch of people and doing an amazing workshop, but they are not good at coaching the implementation or translating the workshop content into the day-to-day. There are people like me who really actually like all the document stuff we did together. Like, I like editing really detailed policy documents and getting in the weeds and stuff. There are lots of consultants who hate that, or who actually just don't do that, or that's not their strength. And so I think you need to really know what your needs are and exactly what the skills are, instead of just, do you know this issue, and like generically around helping people diversify their organizations or bringing a stronger, justice lens to the work. So I think that's a couple of things. And then the other piece, tell me the first question again, because I was so obsessed with answering that.
One was the consultant and the other is readiness.
So I can always tell when organizations are ready and when they're not. And one of the ways is the senior leadership buy-in is incredibly important. And every organization I've worked with has been within a particular spectrum. And what I mean by that is there are organizations that are taking this work on because the board kind of told them they had to. There are other organizations that are taking this on because the leader really gets it, but they have to bring their senior leadership along. There are very few organizations I've worked with where every person in the senior leadership team has total clarity. So I think one of the biggest pieces of readiness is understanding, like, what's instigating the desire to do this. And so I think really asking and answering the question around, do we really have the buy-in to be able to do this work? Now, that said, no organization has 100% buy-in at the beginning, but there's a critical mass of buy-in that you have to have. And to the degree you've got a diversity committee, for example, trying to hire the consultant, but like fighting the senior leadership for resources and time, and it's pretty clear that that posse of people really want this work to happen, and it really does need to happen, but that you haven't done that ownership and buy-in. That's probably the biggest piece around readiness. And then the other part is a calibration around what are you, what's your ambition for what you're trying to get done, and what's really in your bandwidth. So when people say we need to do all of this stuff, but we can only give you a half day with the staff in the next year, it's like, that's not going to happen, And so I think you can start small and you can build strategically no matter where you're starting from. But there are some of these bedrock pieces that until you get enough of them aligned, you're probably going to get in each other's way. Very few organizations, like including Demos to some degree, people don't always start with the rationale first. Like they have to figure out the rationale. They need support building the rationale. But I've worked for organizations where they're like, we've been trying to diversify for 25 years and we're not doing very well. And when I start talking to them, what I first find out is, A, they're leading with diversity in a way that's really just about tokenizing people. But also, they haven't even defined what they mean by diversity. And then they never answer the question about what's the mission critical part of that. If you haven't answered the rationale question, it's almost impossible to do anything else. So that's one of the things that you've got to do early on. And then the other thing I would say is most organizations don't start having really clear language and framing about what the it is. Demos was very clear. From the beginning, they were like, we're talking about racial equity and we're talking about organizational transformation. And transformation is a very big word, but most organizations start by, we want to work on DEI. And my first thing to them is, if you're still calling it DEI, you haven't done any work. Because if you're still calling it DEI and you can't tell me what the D or the E or the I are to you, you've got to have resonant language that frames your work that's unique to your mission. And it doesn't mean you have to have that before you hire the consultant, but that's got to be one of the first things you do. Is if you don't have resonant language that you can actually say like a normal person in a complete sentence, then the it is totally unclear, which is then, if you don't have the it clear, then you can't have the why clear.
There's a question about the diversity of your staff. You've talked about, Lucy, about the transformation of staff from mostly white to mostly people of color and the change in leadership. Did that happen mostly through normal attrition, or did some staff intentionally leave because they weren't on board with the racial equity work, or were they coached out? And then how do you screen for racial equity competencies for candidates?
Sure. So let me start with the first, and please chime in. So our staff went through a pretty high level of turnover over a 2-year period, and a higher level of turnover than we'd had in the past. And there was multiple reasons for that. We had, before that, very, very strong retention rates, and we had a lot of staff who came to Demos and this was their first job. And they stayed here for longer than most young people do. And so there came a point where a number of those young people left the organization. That was kind of natural attrition. There were also some staff who left for a whole host of reasons that we can't pinpoint. It was the racial equity transformation that was the reason they left, but it may have been one component of why they left the organization. We set, as I mentioned, we had a whole new series of expectations for staff. We were asking them to really meet a whole other set of responsibilities and expectations, and I do think for some staff that was not of interest to them, along with a couple other factors that may have led to their departure. Very, very, in terms of staff being coached out, that was the very, very minority of the circumstances of staff leaving and new staff coming in. It was really a combination, a lot of natural attrition, some people wanting to leave for multiple factors, as well as possibly not wanting to meet our new expectations around racial equity.
And I'll just add that that also happened through growth.
Yeah.
Right. So we have 15 more positions than we had at the beginning, and a lot more senior positions than we had at the beginning. And so we wanted to attract in new senior seasoned leaders who could come in with the competencies that Lucy's about to talk about in terms of, which you will find if you go to the Demos website in every job description.
Yes, you won't find those on the website, but that's okay.
Oh, no.
We don't have our job descriptions on the website. But what we do have, I believe in our reports, if it's not there, we can send it to folks. We have a set of screening questions that we asked all staff at our first stage of screening around racial equity. And then we have another set for our second interview cycle, and we have another set from our senior staff. So we have specific language around racial equity analysis, skills and practice that are required for all candidates. We also have, in addition to that, a set of expectations by level of staff. So when candidates are responding to those questions, we're looking for certain kinds of responses that vary depending on the level of staff. So it's very structured. A lot of thought went into that, and we're happy to share those resources with folks, but that's how we screen staff coming into the organization.
I think there are also two complementary chunks that really are responsible for helping organizations really get to the place of representing the constituencies they feel like they need to represent. And one is you just have to clean up your hiring process. A lot of organizations do not have a consistent, fair, hiring process. And my joke is always, friends and family should be your cell phone plan. It really should not be how you recruit and hire or select board members. So, you have to clean up your hiring process and make sure that it actually is fair and consistent, and that there's rigor there. But what Demos did, and a number of other organizations I've worked with do, is they have a high recruitment requirement up front. So before you're allowed to really dig into the hiring process, if you just wait for people to come to you, you're playing into the structural racism and classism of our society, and who is attracted oftentimes to mission-driven work. So if you just naturally have whoever can come or finds out by word of mouth, you're going to get a pretty dominant group posse of people. And so the requirement to really do robust recruitment and to basically say, no, we're not going to start hiring until we've really done a good job. And the idea that, well, none of those people are out there just isn't true. There are plenty of, amazing people. It's just that you may not know them.
Right.
So you have to really do something proactive to bring people in. The last thing I would just say is the thing I would underscore here is that it's not just the demographics of people. It's what are your competencies. Unless those skill sets are built into the must-have qualifications of the job, then you're just kind of tokenizing people based on who you think they demographically represent. So it has to live in the content of the qualifications in order for this really to be successful.
Those racial equity competencies, came out of our process, and we named them. We said you have to have a racial equity analysis about our issues. Right. You have to have be able to make authentic relationships across race and difference, because that's important for the work, right? Campaigning work, legal work, research work, advocacy work. It all actually requires to be great in a multiracial progressive movement. You have to have those skills. You have to be able to give direct communication, because so often that's where things fall down when there are racial conflicts or power dynamics. And then the fourth one is racial equity analysis, direct communication, authentic relationships, self-awareness. Self-awareness of your own group identities and the power dynamics that attach to them. So actually naming that and having job candidates have a conversation about race in the interview and seeing how they do is a really important part of it. It has to do with more than demographics, as Angela said, but also your ability to show up and your skills around these issues.
And many people who come here to interview say, gosh, no one's ever asked me anything about my analysis, my perspective, my orientation around race. So that's been quite interesting to hear from candidates. And I want to correct myself. I think Heather was talking earlier, we have open positions on our website, and in those job postings, you can see we embed our racial equity competencies. Yes, in the job descriptions.
And just one last thing I'll add is, because I meet all of the new staff at Demos, because they all do a racial equity orientation, I can also tell you that one of the things that really attracted people to Demos is the content they saw in the job description. People, they didn't, that little line at the bottom says, oh, we really encourage people who are different from us to apply. That doesn't mean anything if it doesn't feel like it's authentic. And so a lot of people have said, wow, just by reading the description, I was like, wow, these people really do live by this value. They don't just have some random diversity statement up on their website.
One thing I just want to add finally, and then we'll move on.
Can you tell me like each other?
I know this will be is often a follow-up question, is doesn't it take longer to hire staff? And there was a period in which that was very much true. When we still had majority white staff and we had this new requirement, they did not have the networks. They had to try harder. We supported them in that, and hiring did. And that period, it was like a period of 6 to 12 months. It did take longer. Now I would say our hiring, because we have more staff of color who have more racially diverse networks, it's changed quite a bit. Our hiring still takes some time. Hiring should take some time, right? We want to bring people to an organization. You should have a very robust process to do that. People always want it to go faster than it does, and it should, but it should take some time. But it's definitely not as long as it was during that limbo phase when we were transitioning from majority white to majority person of color.
So we have 60 questions in the Q&A, so I want to challenge us to be more succinct in our responses.
Okay, great. I will try to do a good job of feeding them to you. There's some question about sequencing. And Angela, you talked about just the importance of a rationale, why take on this work is one of the first steps. And so folks want to know more about that foundational analysis step, who was involved, were there any challenges given that staff had different levels of understanding of racial equity at the time? And then there's also a kind of sequencing questions about, do you do the internal work first before making it programmatic, or was it more simultaneous?
Really good question. So I'll take this one just because, the foundational analysis was very much my vision as a new president. And so, that was one of the tailwinds we had coming into it, was that I was new to the role. And so I had the opportunity and, in fact, the requirement of setting out my vision for the organization. And so that may not be the case when you are doing this process with, a continuity of leadership. I do think that it would be very possible for the people who are the most passionate about this issue, this set of issues inside an organization, to articulate a rationale and then go on the role of persuading the rest of the organization and the leadership that this is in fact why this is so important to the organization. It would just be harder than if the person or people who already have the decision-making and the authority of the organization have this. But I don't want to say it's impossible, because of course then we would be saying that there couldn't be change in organizations where the leaders just aren't quite there yet. And many leaders see their job as being responsive to the staff. So I would say that the core rationale, which is in an appendix to the report, was slightly specific to Demos, which was a multiracial organization that was working sort of in the heart of a white dominant progressive movement as a think tank. And so our rationale was not, this is important for civil rights, this is important for immigration, this is important for criminal justice. Our rationale was that the core class analysis that had founded the organization, really around economic inequality, and the core democracy analysis that had founded the organization were themselves racial issues in disguise. And so it was really an intervention into a white dominant narrative, which then was accompanied by an intervention into white dominant fields that we were working in. And you'll see in the report, the case study around the Inclusive Democracy Project is very specifically goes into how we try to make the democracy field more racially inclusive and led and centered by groups of color. So I think it's important for there to be some coherence in the analysis, and yet I could see an organization doing a process to get there, right? Ask big questions. You know, what is our mission? Who are our stakeholders? How could we get there if racism was not, attacked in our work? That kind of thing. And then finally, I do think it's important for the people who are making the decisions around the programmatic work to have the analysis. The question was, what's the sequencing? Mm-hmm. If you don't have it, it's hard to make those kinds of programmatic decisions with the sophistication you need. And so it certainly was in our sequencing, the work planning that was informed by about 16 months of internal work and education and learning and reading and workshops, so that when the whole staff on a certain team that was working on Money in Politics, for example, they came in with new references and new ideas about why this was actually a racial equity issue. And we weren't going to win on this issue, for example, in Washington, D.C., where there was a long sort of stymied campaign until there was a racial equity story about why we needed public financing.
Can I, a follow-on question, and maybe this is for you too, Heather, and I find this question comes up a lot. Can you talk more about the decision to focus the transformation on race solely?
Oh, sure, yeah. I think there was an intellectual, sort of analytical motive, and then there was also a motive that was embedded in our culture in the organization. So intellectually, I believe that racism is the Achilles heel of the progressive movement. It's the Achilles heel of progressive change in this country, that we would not have the inequalities and dysfunctions in our democracy and our economy were it not for the fact that our country was built on a racial hierarchy, and that our capitalism was a slave capitalism, and that our democracy rules were written to suppress the political power of people of color. And that impacts the entire system and everyone who operates it. Low-wage workers, whether they're white, black, or brown, people who are going to the polls, whether they're white, black, or brown, or anything else. And so that was the intellectual piece, was that race was the central dilemma. Racism was the central dilemma. And then internally, we were an organization that of that 6-person executive team were all women, except for one man, who's a VP of Finance and Admin. We had been a female-dominant organization in our organizational assessment when we asked about all the different subordinated group identities, sort of where people felt like there was, the most inequity in the organization, where people had the fewest skills, it was around race. We always said that once we create an understanding around the hierarchy of group identities, then we can include work on these other group identities. But we said race is going to be first because it has created the scaffolding of hierarchy in our society, and because we needed to do that work most.
Can you provide some sense of the resources, the financial resources, time resources that were required to take on this work?
I asked Lucy to calculate this because I thought this would be.
So yes, we can. So we put together an estimate of how much this transformation cost us over multiple years. These estimates include staff time, so my time, Heather's time, executive team staff time, other staff time, staff travel to all these workshops that we mentioned, and to learning group meetings, as well as some all-staff retreats. And over a 5-year, and excuse me, and our consultant, over a 5-year period, the costs varied quite a bit depending on how much we were doing each year. As you can imagine, in the early years, when we were doing all that intensive work so closely with Angela, doing the initial intensive learning phase, it was much more expensive than it has been in the past couple of years. And it ranged each year over this 5-year period, and this is from 2014 through the present, from $100,000 a year to around $400,000 a year. Our highest, the $400,000 a year, was when we were doing that intensive learning phase. So it's substantial. And as I say in the report, and I'll say here, it was worth every penny. Absolutely worth that kind of investment. And as I mentioned earlier, we were lucky to have this kind of confluence of tailwinds to allow us the funding, the resources to cover this. So again, ranging from $100,000 to $400,000. And it's baked into our budget now, right? It's not like this kind of project that is special funding. It's baked into every component, every kind of cost center in our annual budgeting process. Would you add anything on that? Yeah.
Angela, maybe you can speak to, just what are some of the challenges for you as a consultant in doing this kind of work, which is not just kind of one shot, but transformative over time, and especially when the field is relatively undeveloped in terms of case studies or methodologies or tools, etc. What were the challenges for you in providing help to Demos?
Yeah, I would say it was easy to work with Demos, because Demos has been by far the most ambitious organization I've ever partnered with. And when I said, gosh, I really think, these 4 things really need to get done, they would say, okay, well, let's figure out how we do all 4 things. Most organizations, so I think maybe I should, instead of answering about what was hard with Demos, maybe more broadly, what's hard to do this work. And I think the hardest thing is when people don't have a long-term vision for what they're trying to accomplish, and instead they have these really little things like, can you come to this meeting? Can you do this one workshop? Or when they're fighting constantly with the people who have power in the organization to just get to do this work. So then it does end up being little drips and drabs. And you can start small and build things in a way that says, like, this is what we can do this year, this is what we can do this fiscal chunk of time. But if they're not connected and you don't have a bigger piece that's tied to people with power in the organization actually valuing this, then it gets really, really chunky. And so one of the worst things is what I call plopping trainings. And so, come and do a training, come for a day, and then it just plops. It plops into people's calendars, it plops into people's work lives. If you don't plan how that workshop is going to actually live and get translated and get managed to within the course of an organization's work, then just having a workshop in and of itself isn't really going to get you much. It's almost like a waste of time. So I think that is one of the issues is no matter how small you start, having a logic for what you're doing first and how it's going to build to something else, and then how you sustain and knit these pieces so they grow on each other. I think that's one of the biggest things. And, you know, because I'm like kind of old hat at this, I'm getting to the point where like I almost interview the clients just as much as they're trying to interview me. Like unless I can get a sense that there really is that openness, at some point it's just not worth my time. Because you know, pushing a boulder uphill that just comes back and smushes everybody is not particularly effective. I would say another thing that's particularly challenging is when people think that all you have to do is come up with a good plan. You know, so I do a bunch of work with them. I help them clarify some priorities, and then they're like, "Okay, great, we got the plan, and we're just going to go." And I'm like, "Okay, you know, unless you have the skill set to implement that plan, sometimes you need a little bit of coaching along the way. And a lot of times it doesn't mean a super expensive chunk of time. Sometimes I feel like the people who've run off with the plan, I'm like, all right. And then literally a year and a half later, they call me and they're like, oh my gosh, you'll never believe what went down. And you got to help us fix this. And it's the kind of thing that if we just had like a hourly check-in once a quarter, and they'd said, we're going to send you a couple of things. Could you just look at it? And then we have this hour-long check-in. I could have said, oh, that's great, but oh my gosh, like that thing, you might want to tweak and like think like a little bit of coaching along the way can go a long, like it doesn't have to be expensive, but I guess this is like when people say, I just want the checklist, tell me what the checklist is, and then I'll do it. It's like, if you don't have the skill set to implement that checklist, this is not going to end prettily. So that's the other thing that I think matters a lot.
I think you're partly answering a question about how smaller organizations with smaller budgets can take this on. I just want to pivot a minute to folks are asking, okay, we see how you made changes in the hiring practices, but were there other internal policies and practices other than hiring that you actually shifted and changed?
Well, one example I would give really quickly is about orientation. The average nonprofit doesn't do a very good job at orientation, and you could argue that that's just something everyone needs to get better at, but you have to be particularly intentional about orientation when you have people who are very different or new to an issue area or people who don't see themselves represented in the organization. Like, you have to be going out of your way to do orientation well. So like, even though it's something that's good for everybody, it's a universally good thing. It's particularly good for the people who are the most different. The other thing I would just name very explicitly is a real attention to management skills. That's the biggest thing that I think people bump up into when they start doing this work is, you know, it's great to do all this work up here. You have to do all those things. But in the end, the day-to-day is all about how does this get managed to. And Demos paid a lot of attention to that. And I think a lot of the clients that I work with who are doing the best job at really living these values are paying explicit attention to the management piece and providing the professional development to really be able to do that.
Because ultimately, these racial equity competencies that we're talking about are just the ways to manage yourself and others well, right? They absolutely are more significant when you layer them onto the power dynamics that exist in our country of cross difference, but they're just self-awareness, the ability to, you know, communicate directly. So we were sort of skill building up around things that are just about how to be a good, strong person in a community, who's able to solve conflicts and address them head on, who's able to anticipate conflicts and anticipate, you know, the way things will fall differently based on people's different, you know, backgrounds and community dynamics and political dynamics. In many ways, it's about just core personal development for people to be able to show up as their best selves in an organization. And that takes a ton of human resources management, right? Lucy ends up spending a lot of time helping to coach managers through issues, helping to coach staff that are having a conflict around something that has a racial dynamic to it. So does Jose Gonzalez, who's now that's his job. That's part of it, right? It really falls into the day-to-day of just dealing with humans in all of our many foibles and the beautiful things that make us different and that bring us together.
And just to add, the hiring of someone, of Jose Gonzalez, who does that work primarily now and does it beautifully with so much skill, was really Angela's suggestion as part of our age equity journey. So that's a direct, new capacity of the organization that came out of our transformation that has been hugely, hugely important. And we can talk about this later, but he now leads our amazing team of staff who now own our transformation work. It's shifted over the past year, 2 years, from me and Angela to this team of staff that has all levels of staff represented.
So there are some foundations on the call, and there are also people who want to work better with foundations around racial equity and funding for this kind of work. So can you talk about the dynamics related to philanthropy and their understanding of racial equity? Did you ever experience any disconnects or misalignment with your funders? Do you have advice for funders who are on this call?
I will try to be brief. Yes, yes, and yes. So first of all, this is where I think the rationale and having a leader who can clearly communicate it is really important. Because I wasn't going to funders and saying, you've really funded us for our work on, low-wage work and debt-free college and voting rights and democracy reform, but now I'd like you to fund us to sit around and talk to each other, right? I had to make the connection and say that it was going to make our work more powerful. So I had to be very fluent in that rationale and be able to go back and forth about it with funders. It's essential, right? I think the world of philanthropy has probably moved. The participation of funders on this call is a big indicator of that, so that it may not be such a heavy lift now to say why this is essential work, but it was certainly really important. I think having an issue analysis, because generally speaking, funders are funding you to solve these problems. So having an analysis about why this work is essential to solving this problem in the world. I remember coaching one of my colleagues in the field who worked with another social justice organization in the environment space. And we had to talk through why it is that racism, as the core political weapon of the right wing, that also wants to deregulate any kind of government role in regulating the environment, is therefore their actual opponent, right? They actually have to deal with the racism that becomes a political weapon for their enemies. And she hadn't thought of it that way, and so she wasn't really able to say to her staff or to her board or her funders why it was important. And then finally, to funders, I would say, I wanted to get Lucy to crunch those numbers to make it really clear that this is work that costs money and time. It's not cheap, and yet once it's really done in an integrated way, it really turbocharges the organization. I think without a doubt, it contributed to our financial growth over the years that we've been doing this work. And so it paid for itself over time, but it is important. And giving your grantees unrestricted funds or funds particularly for this work is one of the most important gifts that you could give to create a highly functioning organization that has what it takes to operate in our current political environment.
I would just say that there is so much that, so much truth to what Heather's flagging about what foundations can and need to do when it comes to engaging with grantees. And I would also argue, because a lot of my clients are foundations and philanthropic networks, there's so much work that individual foundations need to do, and that philanthropic networks on particular issue areas really need to be doing internally for themselves as well. So in addition to supporting grantees to be doing this work in a truly robust way, because it's the only way to win on your issues, you also have to be doing the work yourself. And I think funders sometimes, there's like this weird lack of bravery thing that happened, not in this situation, but in a lot of situations where the grantees are afraid to come right out and say, like, here's the case we need to make about how this is directly tied to our work. Like, they're almost reticent and afraid to say that to funders. And then the funders are sometimes like, ooh, you know, we need to hold our grantees more accountable to thinking about not only their demographics, but the way they're approaching their issues and whether they have any justice plans whatsoever. And sometimes you just have to say that there's a lot of impact you can have by asking a couple of key questions, having some of those really important conversations. So it comes from both sides too.
I think folks can imagine a little bit what this looks like, particularly in Demos's work, as applied to policy, maybe research, but what they're asking about is how does it impact fundraising, communications, and other units like that.
So that rationale that we did at the beginning, we actually had each of the teams, including finance and admin, communications, development, write their own racial equity rationale for theirs. So, in the interest of time, I won't sort of say what everybody's was, but it's essential to ask that question. And guess what? There's going to be one. There's going to be a reason why it's important to understand the racial dynamics of your function in an organization, whether it's the fact your team is coming from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, or the fact that you are operating in a field like development that has huge racial power dynamics. And a person who's a major gifts officer who's going and talking to a elderly white man about our racial equity work has got to be fluent in how to make that case and how to deal with pushback, and that's part of what we teach.
In terms of legal, did your organization, here's a question, did your legal counsel present any challenges with your hiring process, affinity groups, or any other part of your racial equity transformation process?
So we did indeed work with counsel when we were creating our policies around hiring in particular. And they were incredibly helpful and a valuable partner. And the answer is no, they did not. They did give very good advice on how we should be framing why we have the requirement in particular around our interview pools, and really being clear about why that is, the rationale, how it relates to the mission of the organization, and really documenting that in a convincing way, which was very easy for us. But I get this question a lot, like, is that legal? Can you actually require that 50% of people you interview are people of color? And the answer is yes. That does not relate to who ends up being hired. So just a quick answer is we worked with lawyers, we vetted everything, and we're in solid ground. And we're not the only organization that does this, right? We're not alone in this. Angela works with other organizations that do this, and I've met others who do as well.
Also, it needs to be really clear that there's a differentiation between the recruitment process and the hiring.
Right.
No one is told who to hire. And the demographic data collection is kept completely separate from this is the person who is X or Y. It's, people do their selection process and then they say, okay, here's who I'm looking at. And then someone over here who can look up the data says whether you've met your recruitment metric or not, or whether you need to go back. You're never allowed to say, well, here's someone I rejected, but gee, I think they're colorful and will help me meet my metric. You're not allowed to drag that person into your pool. The people you already said are not qualified for this particular first round still aren't qualified. You got to go out and do the research. So the recruitment. So there's a segregation that makes it, fair. But lots of organizations do this. And also lots of organizations have affinity groups. And so these are not, it may be new and shocking to some of us in the mission-driven sectors, but lots of other organizations have been doing these things for a long time.
And I think on the kind of the mechanics of how to do that separation and how to vet the names and the racial diversity, some organizations get, I think, stuck on how complicated that sounds. It's not that complicated, right? I'm happy to let folks know how to do it. It's not complicated. It's very, very much worth doing.
Here's a kind of pulling up a little bit. what most surprised each of you, and briefly, because I think we're coming somewhat to the end of our time, but what most surprised each of you about the process, and what do you wish you would have known when you first started?
So I'll start. Something that came to me when you first asked, Linda, what surprised you. You know, I had a vision going into it that everyone could do the work. It just was sort of like, well, I mean, we're talking about racism here. White people created racism, so they better have some, you know, skill to be able to address it, right? People of color are coming from very different, you know, backgrounds with this issue, very different life experiences, even among Black people, you know, some of whom came to this country as immigrants. Some of them are, like I am, a descendant of enslaved people, very different places. So holding where everyone was coming from and trying to create a coherent experience was certainly a challenge, but in many ways was one of the beautiful things. I mean, I remember, you know, coming into work one day with an agenda full of racial equity learnings, and I just thought, you know, this is the work of this country, right? We are a microcosm of, you know, maybe more politically progressive, right? But we are a microcosm of this country racially and ethnically, and if we who came to work today to figure this out can't do it, then how can the rest of the country? And so, you know, one of the first workshops we had, and because this was a majority white organizations, was we had a white man from another organization come in and talk about how white people can be champions for racial equity. It's got to be possible for everyone to have a way in to improve our circumstances as people in this multiracial democracy. And so it was surprising to me kind of how much you had to hold of everyone's different experiences going into it, but it was also a really wonderful surprise how much by the end both people of color and white people were saying, as Lucy said, that this was a gift, that this helped them in the rest of their lives, that nowhere else would they have gotten this work. It's not happening in school, it's not happening in churches, it's not happening in so many workplaces, but it's the sort of fundamental literacy you need to have to be a person in this country. And so the way that it was a gift and the way that each person was coming at it from very different places but had a lane to contribute was, I think, one of the big sort of surprising revelations for me.
Thank you.
I think one thing I would say about what is always surprising about doing this work is there is a temperament, I guess you could call it, of people who are attracted to mission-driven work. You know, people who want to be on the good side of history, people who really intellectually understand, you know, why it's so important to care about racism and the oppression that happens in the world. But there's a vulnerability that so many of us in mission-driven work carry with us, which is that we want to be one of the good ones. We believe we're one of the good guys. Look, just FYI, we gave up all these things to do nonprofit work or, you know, like whatever. And what always kind of surprises me is the degree to which you have to like pry people's identity as people who already get it away in order to get them to be okay with saying, you know what, I don't know everything. Like, yikes, I intellectually get these issues, but holy smokes, when I look around at my networks and the people I spend time with, the people in my neighborhood, the last 10 weddings I went to, like, I have a really narrow band of people. And so I wouldn't say it shocked me, but I think that is one of the biggest issues, is how do we make it clear that this is not about your goodness or badness as a person. It's really about how could we all be great at this when so few of us have invested the time and the energy or been given the opportunity to really dig into these issues. And so that is one of the biggest things I bump up against all the time, is people feeling like this is a personal critique, that, you know, they're automatically going to lose something if they have any privilege at all by an organization taking on this work. That is I don't think we are as fragile as sometimes we act. And so that's like one of the nuts, I think, to crack as we continue to try to do this work throughout multiple progressive movements.
You know, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, and I want to thank all of you for such a rich conversation, and all the participants on the webinar who asked such thoughtful questions. I'd like to invite all of you on this call to share the DEMOS report with your networks, and remind you that both the recording and the PowerPoint presentation is going to be sent to all participants. And finally, we're going to be closing the webinar today by sharing some resources to turn to for support as you embark on your own journeys. So thank you for coming to this webinar today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for participating.